Hello everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. In order to highlight the contributions migrants make and address the challenges they face, the UN designated December 18th as International Migrants Day. With an aging population, South Korea too has been seeing a growing demand for migrant workers and thus decided to bring in a record high number of them next year. But bringing them in is one thing, offering them a safe working environment is another. Some workers face unsafe working conditions, unpaid wages, and poor shelter to live in. Marking the International Migrants Day, Within the Frame aims to mainly focus on the difficulties some migrant workers face. And for this, we invite Professor Cho Hee-kyung from Hongik University. Welcome, Professor Cho.
Hello.
And we also have Professor Ian from Handong International Law School. Good to see you, Professor Lee.
Well, thanks for having me again.
All right. Now, Professor Lee, first of all, through what system do most migrant workers come to South Korea for work? Is it the E9 work visa for manual and non-professional work, or are there any other methods?
Right. So under the current employment system, foreigners who want to stay long-term within Korea and want to work can be basically classified into sort of two categories, one for non-professionals and others for professional work. And so, the idea here is the employment permit system was designed to really help fill sort of these simple technical jobs. And so, as you mentioned here, sort of the E9 visa classification really is for those people who are sort of non-professional employees. And so that would be people who are working in the agricultural sector, manufacturing, in the fishing industry. And so this system was sort of in place in order to sort of attract more workers to fill sort of the growing need in the Korean economy to address sort of the lowering workforce in the Korean economy in this system. So you're quite right in terms of saying the E9 visa system is sort of in place in order to attract these non-professional workers into Korea and then provide a system in order to manage them, but also protect them while they're in the country.
All right, thank you for your explanation, Professor Lee. Now, Professor Cho, let's now take a look at the difficulties or issues some migrant workers face. Usually, as far as I know, migrant workers write a contract in their home countries before coming to South Korea without many details given. And this can lead to many small and big issues, such as those regarding wages and work hours. Could you tell us what difficulties many migrant workers face regarding working conditions?
As you mentioned, usually the migrant workers' problems actually begin at home because typically they cannot directly enter into a contract with an employer in Korea. Usually there is a broker in the home country who arranges the employment contract with the employers. And very often the terms of the employment would be either very general or the worker would be promised certain conditions, such as the kind of job that they would be doing, the kind of accommodation that they would receive, the wages that they would receive, they would also get, etc., etc. But once they arrive in Korea, they find that the reality is actually very different to what they were promised in the contract. So they might be doing some sort of job that's actually quite different to what they were promised. They might be working much longer hours than they were promised. They might be also paid much lower salary than what they were promised. And as a result, a lot of workers become unhappy. Typically, there's also, in many cases, physical violence or verbal abuse from the employer, particularly in rural and isolated areas. And the workers find it very difficult to get help. And because their visa status is dependent and linked to the workplace, they can't leave the workplace to find a new job, for example. So they end up in very difficult position because they still owe a debt in their home country to the brokers, and most of them would have actually borrowed money to come to Korea.
Right, I see. So poor working conditions could partly be because of the brokerage system, as our Professor Cho mentioned. Now, Professor Lee, housing is also a serious issue among migrant workers. There was even the tragic case of a Cambodian worker found dead in her dormitory, which was just a vinyl greenhouse in 2020. How serious are their living conditions?
Well, unfortunately, about 20% of migrant workers live in very sort of poor conditions, and we would say, kind of like shanties. And that's usually basically a housing that is made up of corrugated steel sheets, or basically in shading nets, or even in containers. And so, as you mentioned, that there's this unfortunate incident in 2021 where a Cambodian worker froze to death in a greenhouse, plastic greenhouse housing. And so the difficulty here is, how do you address this particular problem of these workers living in these very, very poor conditions? Now, under Korean law, the workers have to be housed in adequate and safe housing conditions. However, the regulations do allow for temporary buildings that are approved by the local government. And so what this means is, oftentimes, the employers want to house the workers near the places where they work. So, for example, in the agricultural sector, you want to locate the workers near the fields. If you're sort of in a factory setting, you want to locate near the factory. And so this incentive to sort of allow these workers to live near their workplaces provides sort of employers with maybe the financial incentive to actually now provide housing sort of at a reduced sort of quality. And also, I think that the contributing factor in terms of the problems for housing for migrant workers is that basically 20% of the migrants' workers' paychecks can be reserved for housing. So the migrant workers have to pay for housing. And so this can be taken out of the worker's salary. And so a lot of times there's a financial incentive of the employers to sort of provide sort of the least quality, lowest cost housing in order to save money on sort of the salaries paid to the workers. And so this sort of financial incentive here provides sort of an unfortunate opportunity for employers to provide very poor housing, and this contributes to the problems of migrant workers in certain locations.
All right, I see. I mean, it's quite surprising how some of the workers need to live in vinyl greenhouses and containers. It is indeed an issue we need to tackle. Now, Professor Cho, unfortunately, many migrant workers end up undocumented as well. Among many reasons for this is workers not having the right to change their workplaces without their employer's permission. Could you tell us more about this?
It's very much linked to the harsh and difficult conditions that these migrant workers often find themselves in. Our death rate workplace death rate is some of the highest in OECD countries. Just in last year, we had over 800 workplace deaths. This is just from accidents, not including illnesses from as a result of workplace illnesses. But out of those, 12% actually are comprised of migrant worker deaths. Now, when we think about the working population, which is about 28 million in Korea, and the migrant worker numbers, which is just over 1.2 or 3 million, it works out that migrant workers constitute maybe 3 or 4% of the total working population. So if you extrapolate that, then workplace death of migrant workers should be also corresponding to that percentage of 3 to 4%. But in fact, it's actually 3 or 4 times higher than in normal population. So it shows how dangerous the situation their workplaces often are. And in many cases, migrant workers also face, as I mentioned earlier, physical and verbal abuse from their employers. And in many female migrant workers' cases, also sexual violence from their employers. But as soon as they leave their workplace or try to escape that dangerous and violent situation, they immediately become undocumented resident because their visa is linked directly to their workplace. And so they become an illegal resident. And as a result, they essentially lose all basic protection that their visa would have entitled them to.
Right, it sure needs to change indeed. Now, of course, we need to note that there could be some cases where some foreign workers deliberately violate the conditions of their employment and become classified as illegal. However, I'd like to ask if there are any other reasons or structural issues that result in them becoming undocumented against their will. So, Professor Lee, could you walk us through those circumstances?
Right. So as Professor Joe mentioned earlier in some of the questions that you had asked with respect to how they become undocumented, right, the biggest reason for this, of course, is, as Professor Joe mentioned, their visas are tied to one particular workplace. And so if the workplace doesn't provide sort of sufficient funds for them to be able to pay off their debts that they incur trying to get over to Korea, this obviously gives them incentive to sort of leave their workplaces and therefore, as Professor Joe mentioned, become undocumented. But of course, there are lots of host of other reasons why someone becomes undocumented, and some of the issues that Professor Joe raised also additionally with respect to just the working conditions, health and safety issues. Another big issue that also occurs that is really problematic is not being paid on time. Especially in terms of what's required under law, because when you become working in Korea, you are subject to the same protections as any other worker, national or foreigner in Korea. And that means, for example, you should get paid at least minimum wage. And so when people do not get paid the minimum wage that they're entitled to under Korean law, this obviously gives people incentive then to leave their jobs because of the financial pressures that they're already under, given the circumstances of the debt that they incurred coming to Korea. But the other issues that you find lots of other places, discrimination, workplace violence, I mean, the kinds of abuses that are documented by NGO groups with respect to certain places where, women are subjected to sexual abuse as well. So, I mean, because of this system, a lot of these people work in places that are not very large companies, small and medium-sized industries. A lot of these places are not, let's say, supervised by local government officials to a certain degree. And so therefore, a lot of these abuses can happen to migrant workers and therefore causes them to then leave their jobs and therefore then become undocumented. And as Professor Cho mentioned, they're not then afforded the protections under Korean law, which you would have if they were legal in the country.
Right, so many structural issues are making them to be undocumented. And that being said, Professor Cho, once they become undocumented, it means it is illegal for them to stay in the country. What human rights violations or difficulties do they face when that happens?
Well, they become immediately subject of deportation. So if you are found and caught as an undocumented resident in Korea, then they could be immediately sent back to their own country, which they do not necessarily want to because they still owe lots of money to people in their home country. They often have to support their families. They have to find some way to send money back home. And so they often try to stay in Korea and to try to find another job. But as an illegal resident, that's in almost all cases very difficult. They essentially become shadows in our society. And so even if they are able to find a job, even if they find an employer who are willing to employ them as despite their illegal status, they will be in a situation where they can't really insist on their rights to be paid proper wage. And even as migrant workers, they usually don't have the right to even have their spouse in the country. And if you happen to have a child together with somebody else, then that child ends up becoming a stateless person. So these illegal residents are constant fear of being caught and sent back, and usually are subject to bad treatment by their employers.
I see. It is quite tragic to hear that they become, shadows of the legal system when they actually came here to, work. Professor Lee, that being said, what revisions do you believe are needed for the kinds of clauses that can lead people to be illegal?
Well, to Korea's credit, Korea is one of the first Asian countries that was a labor importing country to pass a law to protect the rights of migrant workers. So that's really a great thing for the Korean legal system to address this issue. But obviously, can be lots of areas of improvement. And one, I think, area of improvement can be, next year, basically, the employment permit system is going to allow for, restaurants, for instance, to hire migrant workers. And these are restaurants that have fewer than 5 employees. But with respect to this situation, the labor standards acts that apply to, again, all workers in Korea under Korean labor law, provide for sort of minimum conditions for protections for workers, such as, number of hours you can work, as well as periods of rest. And the one question that will be asked, of course, with respect to migrant workers is, will they be afforded the same kind of protections and sort of the supervision of the government for those smaller businesses that may, for example, abuse maybe migrant workers' rights when it comes to these kinds of labor standards. Also, the question about the working environments themselves. The idea is that, if you have an undocumented worker, sometimes businesses in Korea would rather hire these undocumented workers just because they have more leverage over them. And so whether or not the government will be able to then address these issues in terms of the undocumented workers and then fining or somehow preventing employers from abusing these undocumented workers. And lastly, there was talk about, in terms of next year's budget for the Korean government is to eliminate basically foreign worker support centers. And this is a big issue because, a lot of these foreign workers, the only place that they can go to for resources for protection of their rights, as well as other kinds of just daily resources for them, are these support centers. And so if you don't have these support centers, where are the workers going to go then to have their rights addressed and also their concerns voiced when it comes to these kinds of issues? So I think there are a number of things that the Korean government should be looking at, obviously, to protect migrant workers and the plight of these people in the country.
Right, I see your point. I mean, we are going to talk about how the government is trying to, get rid of the support centers for the workers. But before that, Professor Cho, we have been mostly talking about undocumented foreign workers right now. But those who are even registered as legal foreign workers reportedly have also limited rights. Could you walk us through those?
So one of the biggest disadvantages that they have is that as migrant workers, they cannot exercise one fundamental right that every worker is supposed to have, which is the right to unionize. As a worker, you are often at a huge disadvantage in terms of bargaining power vis-a-vis the employer. And the only way that workers are usually able to garner or gain some sort of, or try to balance their position with the employer is through collective action. But as a migrant worker, you are not allowed to do this. You are prohibited from doing that. And if you engage in any kind of collective action, then you would be immediately categorized as doing something that's in violation of your visa conditions, and you can be dismissed from your workplace, you can be deported immediately from the country, etc. Another thing is that typically under their employment contract, they're actually not allowed to marry. Now, being able to find a partner, form a family is, again, one of the most fundamental human rights that we have. But these workers, just because they are migrant workers, are denied those rights. And, if you can't help, for example, falling in love with somebody, have a relationship, and maybe have a child, that child becomes a stateless person in our society. They are neither entitled to any education, healthcare, nothing. That, what fault do they have apart from being born? And so these are the kind of things that we are really not doing right as a society. We essentially treat these migrant workers as simple labor resource rather than human beings with dignity that should be treated with dignity.
All right, I see. They're currently deprived of right to unionize and marry. All right, well, Professor Lee, without structural issues being sufficiently addressed, South Korea decided to bring in an all-time high of 165,000 non-professional migrant workers next year. How many foreign workers will be allocated to each different industry or sector?
Right. So this is an all-time high, and to address some of the labor shortages in these industries. And so what you're seeing here is for the manufacturing sector, this is the biggest group allocated. So that will be 95,000 migrant workers can work in the manufacturing sector. And then there will be 16,000 workers for the agricultural sector. And then you'll have 13,000 for the service industries, and then 10,000 for fishing, 6,000 for construction, and then 5,000 for shipbuilding. And then the remaining 20,000 migrant workers will be distributed regardless of the industry. So this is how the distribution will work out with respect to the E9 visa. And as we noted here, this is a record high because of the shortages in the labor market in the Korean economy.
All right, I see your point. Now, we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask this last question to our Professor Cho. Like our Professor Lee already mentioned, though a record high number of, foreign workers is expected to come next year, support centers that operated to help migrant workers are actually going to shut down because of the budget cuts. What are the concerns regarding this, and what government policies regarding the system do you believe should be in place?
Yes, these migrant worker support centers will be closed down because of the budget cut. And the tragic fact is that their annual budget was only 7 billion won, which is less than $6 million. Now, this is a quarter of the increase amount of travel budget that the president has spent this year, and 1/3 of the additional increase that the president is going to spend in terms of travel budget next year. So overall, the 7 billion won in budget for these migrant support centers is essentially 1/10 of the 70 billion won that they have budgeted for president's overseas travel for next year's budget. And I question who actually adds greater value to Korean economy. There is a book called The Sesame Leaf Struggle, which documents how women, mostly from Southeast Asian countries, who work on our farms and greenhouses, essentially picking and growing the vegetables that come onto our tables that we can't do without at every meal. Now, an average worker, typically from Vietnam, a female in their 20s or 30s, have to pick something like 15,000 sesame leaf a day. If you are picking one leaf every 1.5 seconds, you're still spending 6 to 8 hours just to pick. And if you don't make your quota, then you get docked salary. Now, this is the kind of treatment that these migrant workers, who are essential workforce in our society now, face. And the government is actually having some sort of, double standard, because on the one hand, they're saying immigration is the only solution to our low birth rate. And on the other hand, they're saying, well, we are going to cut all budget for the support centers, which actually provide essential minimum protection to these workers. And so what the government really should do is, once again, I come back to the fact that these people are not just working machines, they are not automatons, but they are human beings that deserve treatment with dignity, and that's what they should remember.
All right, I cannot agree more, Professor Cho. Well, hopefully proper inclusive policies will lead to better working environments for foreign workers and immigrants here. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Cho and Professor Lee, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
That's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.